So last up, in creating the geometry for this landscape, is just to add some rockier shapes that we can then use the displacement on top of. Now we don't need to do this, it may be that the displacement's enough, but for the purposes of this tutorial I would like to show you how, just in case it's something you would like to do in the future. So the first thing I want to do is disable this colour, just break this, and take a look at the wireframe. So one thing we notice is that although we have smooth and evenly quadded geometry here, on some areas it's not. So if we did want to use the displace along normal, we might want to remesh some of these areas to prevent artifacts from occurring when we use the displace node. So if we drop down a remesh, and before I plug this in, I want to change some of these settings, otherwise it may take a long time to compute. I'll set the target size to 1, and this is the target edge length. And I've set the iterations to 1 to prevent it from over calculating more than what we need at the moment. So set that to 1, and I'll plug this in. And allow it to compute. Great, so now this is done, we will drop down another attribute VOP. And I could really have done all of these within the same attribute VOP, but I'm just trying to be a little bit more organized for the purposes of this training. So attribute VOP, and jump inside. I'll connect the P to the P, and we will drop down a displace along normal. We'll drop down a texture node, and an import vertex attribute. So with the import vertex attribute node, what we want to do here is to bring in the UVs that exist on the mesh, but at the moment we don't have any UVs, so we need to create some. UV unwrap, and plug this in. If we go to the viewport, we can press space and 5 to switch to the UV view. What you will see is something that looks completely unusable at the moment, but if we type in something like 0.001 on the spacing, we'll see we'll get a much more appropriate set of UVs. Okay, now these are by no means perfect, but we can definitely use these in the texture generation moving forward. So these are fine. We will press space 1 again and go back to the attribute VOP. Jump inside. Now the reason we used import vertex and not import point, which we could have used, import point, or primitive or detail, is, as I outlined earlier in the geometry spreadsheet, is these attributes can be assigned to either point, vertices, primitives, or detail. In this case, UVs are set to vertex. I would definitely be careful, because there are many times where you will be trying to work out what's wrong, and the only thing wrong is that you haven't brought them in the correct way. We'll set this to first input, connect these up, connect this to amount, and we will leave this unconnected for the moment. One thing we can do if we want to check the texture scale is to plug this into CD so we can see the colour. And at the moment we have the mandrel texture being projected onto the UVs. It may be that you want to change the scale of the UVs, and that's pretty easy. you can drop down and multiply constant, which does what it says. It multiplies whichever values are coming in by the constant that you set here. And we can set it to something like 20. The higher you go, the smaller the UVs, as you can see. I will navigate to the texture that I need. Plug this in here. In this case, it's just little rocks that you can kind of pick out. I'll switch this to the displacement map and not the albedo. So what I'll do next is I'll plug the P position into the displaced normal node and plug that in. I'll also remove the colour from now and change it back to smooth shaded. Now it's working, we're getting some displacement. We can crank this up to see some more. A little much. And potentially a little small. But of course we want this only to affect the areas where we have the bedrock. So let's go back into the previous attribute VOP up here and jump inside. We will drop down a bind export, which is the exact same as the bind, except that it has some options already active. Override type with input just changes whichever type you have here with the type that's input from the previous node. Use this node to set parameter attributes, just updates any attributes that exist with the new attribute you are creating here. And finally, export when input is connected activates the input connection. And we can see by changing this to bedrock and going to the geometry spreadsheet that we are changing it from its previous values. If we look at the values now versus what they look like with this disconnected or even deleted, the bedrock is now changed. Awesome. So we can bring this new attribute into this VOP here. Okay, so jump inside and go back to the scene view. We will put down a mix, which again mixes two of these attributes together. We will mix the new displaced geometry with the old position. And bring in, or bind in, the bedrock attribute as the mask. Awesome. So we can try different masks and we can try different geometries and different maps to see what works best for us. But considering we will be doing most of our interest, or generating most of our interest in the texture, this is probably fine. So this is all I actually want to do with the geometry, and all the information that will be applied to this from now on will be within texture and within the scattering and the scene assembly. Okay, thanks.